Thank you for joining us at this important hearing. I am honored to be filling in for Chairman Castro this morning. I want to extend a warm welcome to our witnesses today, Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations Affairs, Michele J. Sison. This subcommittee hearing will cover the Bureau for International Organizations budget requests for fiscal year 2023. This is the first budget hearing for the Bureau in many years, and it is an opportunity for this committee to investigate the administration's goals at the United Nations and multilateral organizations. During this hearing, I look forward to the discussion on the various issues the Bureau for International Organizations faces. The United States contributes millions of dollars each year to the United Nations efforts to managing conflicts through peacekeeping operations, addressing food insecurity, supporting refugees, and so much more. This funding is in our national interest, and this hearing is an opportunity to discuss these priorities. The United Nations and other international organizations are deeply engaged in responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This includes efforts by the World Food Programme and other bodies to address regional and global food insecurity that has been made worse by the war. The UN High Commission for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration are playing important roles in helping refugees. The UN and the International Criminal Court has taken on key roles in documenting war crimes in Ukraine and will be crucial venues for pursuing accountability. I look forward to hearing how the administration's budget requests would address these priorities. I also look forward to the testimony on how the United Nations can continue to adapt to a changing world and what the Biden administration will be doing to ensure it remains effective. The world has never been more interconnected. Many of the crises we are facing are truly global in nature. The reality is there is no way for us to face them alone. Strong relationships with international institutions are our best hope for finding cooperative solutions to these problems. With that, I will now turn it to the ranking member, Miletakis, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairwoman, for this important hearing and for your efforts to support international organizations and making sure that the United Nations and other groups are funded, but that they also meet their mission. The United Nations is comprised of 193 nations across the globe, yet the United States pays for 22% of the United Nations regular budget and 26.94% of the UN peacekeeping budget. I have to ask, what does the United States receive in return for this investment of United States tax dollars? As a member of this body, we must ensure that the funds that the U.S. grants to the UN are used in a way that ultimately benefit the American taxpayer. This was certainly not the case when the World Health Organization echoed the statements given to them by the Chinese Communist Party at the start of the pandemic. In Ranking Member McCall's COVID-19 Origins report, it was noted that from the beginning stages of the COVID-19 outbreak, the WHO, under the leadership of Director General Tedros, repeated and upheld CCP statements as truth. An examination of WHO public statements, including praise of the CCP's handling of the pandemic, reveals a disturbing willingness by the organization to ignore science and other credible sources. While we do not know everything that happened at the WHO when the threat of the COVID-19 first appeared, we do know that the Director General, Tedros, actively engaged in an effort to defend the CCP's leadership from criticism. This bowing to the CCP influence negatively impacted the world's understanding of COVID-19 and hampered the global response effort at a critical moment. It appears to me that given the amount of financial contributions the United States makes to the UN, we would have some input into the operations of its agencies. However, the WHO continues to reject the calls of the United States and our allies to include Taiwan as in the World Health Assembly. From 2009 to 2016, Taiwan held observer status at WHO meetings, but this changed after Taiwan elected a government that was far less accommodating to the CCP. Additionally, we must see reforms made to other entities, such as the United Nations Human Rights Council, which has some of the most egregious human rights violators as its members, including China, Cuba, and Venezuela, who cover up human rights violations in many different countries, including the horrors conducted upon China's Muslim Uyghur population. Since 1945, the UN has accomplished incredible things, and I look forward to ensuring that their good work does continue in the future, but we must also ensure that the funding that we provide will be used in the most effective way possible to better the lives of American taxpayers, that they go back to their original mission. The United States must continue to use its voice and vote at the UN to pursue necessary reforms, advocate for accountability and transparency, support vital humanitarian efforts, and stand up against the malign influence of actors like Russia and CCP. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. We have with us today the Honorable Michele Sison, the Assistant Secretary for State for the Bureau of International Organization Affairs with the U.S. Department of State. Ms. Sison was recently confirmed by the Senate in December to lead this critical bureau and previously served as the United States Ambassador to Haiti, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Lebanon, and the UAE. Ms. Sison, you have 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Malliotakis, and members of the subcommittee for having me here today with you to discuss the fiscal year 23 budget request for the UN and other international organizations. The Bureau of International Organization Affairs, IO, prioritizes our engagement with the UN and with the multilateral system to advance U.S. national interests and strengthen the international system to address today's global challenges and to deliver real benefits to the American people. Now, in order to achieve this, we work tirelessly to defend the founding principles and values of the system, especially against efforts by our competitors to reshape them. And we continue to push for reforms to ensure that international organizations deliver results with good governance, efficiency, and accountability. I greatly appreciate the strong interest of the subcommittee in this important work. Now, I last appeared before you on February 15th, and it has been an eventful last 5 months, to say the least. IO successfully mobilized to bring our partners on board to win overwhelming UN General Assembly condemnation of Russia's aggression just days after Russia's unprovoked further invasion of Ukraine, as well as swift international affirmation of the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. We isolated and blocked Russia from leadership in numerous UN bodies, including suspension from the Human Rights Council, the HRC. We galvanized partners to hold Russia accountable by helping establish an independent commission of inquiry to investigate Russia's violations and abuses of human rights in Ukraine. We also recognized early on that strategic targeted actions across the UN specialized and technical agencies would be crucial in cementing international consensus calling out Russia's human rights violations and war crimes. In fact, we won adoption of joint statements and resolutions calling Russia out for its illegal aggression against Ukraine across the UN system, including within the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Health Assembly, the International Civil Aviation Organization, to name just a few. We also worked successfully with like-minded governments to block the election of Russia to the World Food Program Executive Board. And as we remain focused on the urgent Ukraine crisis, we are also committed to protecting and strengthening the rules-based international order, the system of law, instruments, and institutions to prevent conflict and promote the rights of all people. Now, Secretary Blinken made these points in his May speech on the administration's approach to the People's Republic of China. He emphasized the importance of working with our allies and with our partners to advance our vision of an open and inclusive international system. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield was up on the Hill last month, and she highlighted that the president's budget makes the case for the resources and authorities needed to assert multilateral leadership, and that our failure to live up to our financial obligations at the UN gives our adversaries an easy talking point with which to criticize us and with which to undermine our positions. We need to be able to pay our assessments in full and on time. This not only helps bolster U.S. leadership in the multilateral arena, it helps us rally other countries to our cause. Now, paying our peacekeeping arrears is essential to maximizing U.S. credibility and influence at the UN. We need to be at the table when international consensus is being built so we can advance U.S. values and interests. Thus, the President's budget also requests the authority and funding to enable U.S. leadership in organizations such as UNESCO. In the absence of U.S. leadership at UNESCO, the PRC and others have been more assertive there, seeking to shape the debate on issues like artificial intelligence in ways hostile to democratic norms. In fact, across the UN, we see the PRC and Russia attempting to chip away at human rights. Now, our Bureau, is working hard to counter this disturbing trend. We advanced our U.S. priorities at our first session back as a UN Human Rights Council member in the March session. We succeeded in passing U.S. priority resolutions to renew mandates on Syria, Belarus, Iran, and North Korea. During the most recent UNHRC Human Rights Council session, which wrapped up last week, we led a robust joint statement criticizing the open-ended mandate of an anti-Israel commission of inquiry. We also kept the spotlight on human rights abuses in the PRC, including in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, speaking out with our partners in a joint statement. We led lobbying efforts to renew the independent expert focused on sexual orientation and gender identity, expanding the inclusion and protection of members of marginalized and vulnerable groups. We also supported the HRC's urgent focus on women and girls in Afghanistan. Now, briefly turning to food security, it's estimated that Russia's unprovoked war on Ukraine may drive 40 million or more additional people worldwide into extreme poverty and food insecurity this year. You may have noted that Secretary Blinken used our May UN Security Council presidency to clearly define the link between conflict and food insecurity. He highlighted also that every driver of food insecurity has been made worse by President Putin's war of choice. Thus far, 98 countries have signed on to the roadmap we, the U.S., launched in May to tackle this growing global food security crisis. And we're working right now around the world with countries to urge them to increase the resources we are providing to the World Food Program and the Food and Agriculture Organization. We're focused on a range of evolving challenges.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your testimony. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each pursuant to House rules. All time yield is for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority, altering between majority and the minority. I can only call on you if you are present with your video on. Please turn your video on function to gallery view so you can see everyone else in the room. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we will circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. Given the time constraints with this hearing, I will be strict with the 5-minute limit for questions so we can get every member the opportunity to participate. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. As you know, there has been bipartisan support for the International Criminal Court's investigation into the atrocities being committed in Ukraine. According to existing US law, what types of assistance are we able to provide for the ICC's Ukraine investigation? What types of assistance are prohibited?
Thank you for that important question, Madam Chair. The U.S. is pushing across the UN system for accountability on Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, illegal invasion in Ukraine. I will turn to the ICC in a moment. I want to underscore again the Commission of Inquiry, which was launched by the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, which is focused on violations and abuses of human rights and of international humanitarian law in the context of Russia's aggression. And this is the most robust type of investigative mechanism that the HRC can establish. It's the first time in the HRC's history that it's also established a commission of inquiry related to Russia. On the ICC, we, the US, fully support the documentation and investigative capacities of the ICC. The ICC head was in Washington, met with us in the International Organization Affairs Bureau, was also meeting with our folks on the Global Criminal Justice Team. Accountability using all of these mechanisms is absolutely essential.
There are more displaced people on Earth now than any time in human history. Climate change and conflict continue to force millions of people from their homes each year. The wars in Ukraine and Ethiopia and the end of the US war in Afghanistan have also contributed to this largely. With famine looming in the Horn of Africa and a global food security crisis looming, there's going to be even worse before it's going to get worse before it gets better. What's the administration's plan for supporting UNHCR and the IOM through this year's budget?
Thank you for raising these important matters. So the IO Bureau, with our colleagues in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, focuses, as you note, Madam Chair, on supporting UNHCR and IOM, but also the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, and UNRWA as well. Our Bureau also works, and you mentioned global food security issues, with the World Food Program, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the Food and Agriculture Fund. Now, the funding for IOM and UNHCR, of course, is focused on providing protection and direct assistance to refugees, asylum seekers, and other vulnerable migrants in all of those geographic areas that you've just noted. And it also focuses on capacity building for the host countries' own migration authorities, also focuses on civil society capacity building to support these vulnerable populations.
Thank you. The Ukraine supplemental recently passed by Congress and signed into law by President Biden includes $5 million to address global security challenges resulting from these crises that we've just talked about. Is this funding sufficient to meet the challenges we currently face? And how is the administration working with the World Food Program and other stakeholders to get the aid out as soon as possible?
I was just in Rome talking with the World Food Program, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and IFAD about 10 days ago on the global food crisis that Russia's war on Ukraine has exacerbated. Of course, the supplemental is focusing not only on the population of Ukraine and the needs in the surrounding countries by the displaced populations, but as you know, the impact of Russia's blockade of Ukraine's Black Sea ports has strangled Ukraine's economy, but has also had an impact on sub-Saharan Africa, on the Horn of Africa, on the Middle East. We are working closely with the UN's food agencies, but also with the humanitarian affairs part of the UN, Martin Griffiths' OCHA piece of this, looking for solutions to reopen the Black Sea ports to facilitate those grain and other food exports
Thank you.
because
I'll circle back on that question later on if we have more time. I will now recognize the representative from New York, Teeny, Representative Teeny.
Can you hear me? Let me move this up. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Acting Chair, and thank you to our witness today. First, I want to just ask a question about Israel. Assistant Secretary Sison and the UN Human Rights Council is undertaking an unprecedented open-ended commission of inquiry against Israel. What is the State Department doing to respond to this latest, arguably biased effort by the UN to delegitimize Israel?
good to see you again, Representative Tenney. We have continued to lead a multinational effort to end this open-ended and vaguely defined commission of inquiry concerning Israel. In partnership with Israel, the U.S. led and lobbied in support of a joint statement that criticized the open-ended nature of the Commission of Inquiry mandate. This garnered over 20 signatures. So working with our partners, we drew the attention of the international community. We also issued by our Secretary of State Blinken, released a statement on June 7th after the release of that first report by the COI, firmly opposing the Commission of Inquiry and its one-sided biased approach. We will continue to push for a reduction of resources to the COI. We were successful last December in the UN's Fifth Committee, the Budget Committee, in a 25% reduction in staffing positions. The issue of working with our partners, I think, is critical here, and we will continue to do so.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And when it comes to Russia, I know there's obviously a lot of criticism of the UN, particularly its effectiveness. And Russia repeatedly uses its as a P5 member on the UN Security Council to block crucial votes, particularly related to its unprovoked war against Ukraine. Through China and Russia wielding such veto powers, the war in Ukraine, other crises around the world, the war in Syria, the genocide against the Uyghurs in China, have essentially continued to go unchecked by the United Nations. How would you assess the effectiveness of the UN in responding to these emerging crises and the fact that it's just not being viewed positively by not just people in the United States, but across the world as not really dealing with these obvious violations of what the UN code and what its purpose is? If you could just do that quickly, because I have a couple quick questions after that.
Sure, I agree. I agree completely that
Yes.
Russia's egregious violations are an affront to the core mandate of the UN Security Council. It's outrageous that a permanent member is acting in this manner, particularly in so many violations of UN principles. It commits theoretically to defend as a member of the Security Council. Again, we were successful in isolating Russia in a number of the UN agencies in Rome, in Geneva, in Vienna, in New York, and we had 3 historic votes in New York condemning Russia's behavior, in which 141 member states in condemning Russia's aggression.
Right.
Russia's feeling this.
Honestly, I appreciate that, and I know you aren't all powerful, but with due respect, Assistant Secretary, we have a war that's still raging. Lives are being, people are being murdered every day, and we don't seem to. The UN doesn't seem to be able to resolve that issue. And one quick question I wanted to get into about Taiwan. Obviously, China is trying to rewrite the rules of the international order and drive their own agenda, especially when it comes to the World Intellectual Property Organization. By excluding Taiwan from being represented at the WHO and the International Civil Aviation Organization. What is the administration doing to counter these efforts? This is a really critical issue right now happening with Taiwan. If you could just tell me that quickly, because, well, I guess I'm not going to get to my last question, but you got 44 seconds.
Absolutely, Representative Tenney.
Yeah.
I lobbied personally with the Director General of the WHO on the issue of the World Health Assembly. We were not successful this year, but we did have the partnership of an unprecedented number of countries, more than 20, directly mentioned their support for Taiwan in their national statements during May's World Health Assembly. That was a big
Let me
deal.
ask you, is there a way that we can make the UN actually do something that's effective in improving the world order instead of just kind of a discussion group to talk about it? Do you think how do we make that happen in the future?
With our relentless focus of working with our partners to lift up all of these issues that you are raising, territorial integrity, sovereignty, misuse of the UN Charter in arguments, and again, supporting Taiwan's participation, civil aviation, world health, and a number of other critical areas.
Thank you so much. My time has run out. I yield back.
I now recognize the gentlelady from California, the vice chair of this subcommittee, Congresswoman Jacobs.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Assistant Secretary, for being here with us. I actually just returned from a trip to South Sudan, where I had a chance to visit with the UNMISS peacekeeping operation and observe the important work that they're doing to provide security for internally displaced people and humanitarian convoys. And I also spent some time with peacekeepers, including U.S. service members who provide support to the missions. And, in all these conversations, they told me about the challenges they're facing in doing their jobs. And a consistent message I heard is that there wasn't enough resources to do what they needed to do in order to implement their mandate. And that's one reason why I've sponsored legislation so that the U.S. can actually pay all of its peacekeeping dues each year. So, I'd like to hear your views on my proposal, which is also in the House version of the Competes bill, and how you would describe the impact on peacekeeping missions when the leading financial contributor doesn't pay its dues on time and in full.
First of all, thank you very much for going out and visiting those peacekeepers and UNMISS, and traveling with Ambassador Chris Liu from our Management and Reform team in New York. I'm really grateful for the question and for your sustained interest in these matters, and completely agree with your view on the issue of paying our bills in full and on time. And again, when we fail to meet our commitments, we are giving space to the People's Republic of China and others to advertise themselves as the, quote, responsible UN member. It's easy ammunition. These narratives, which we push back on, but we hear them. We hear them in our budget committee. These narratives diminish our ability as the U.S. to build coalitions in places such as the Budget Committee, the Fifth Committee, where our delegation is really not only trying to make the UN operate more efficiently and effectively, but make sure that we resource aspects that we care about that others don't. Protection of civilians, human rights protections, lifting up women and girls. These are areas where some countries are not putting their emphasis. So as a leading contributor to the UN and its most influential founding member, we should not be giving our competitors this easy ammunition and a way to undermine our credibility.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to working with you to try and make sure that we get this through the Congress so that we can help you all do your work better. As you know, prior to becoming a member of Congress, I worked for the UN in peacekeeping and at UNICEF, and I saw firsthand why it matters which countries' nationals are in which positions. And I believe it's critical that the US government does more to help Americans obtain UN positions, from the most senior posts to entry-level positions. We also need to ensure that the talent pipeline is diverse, and we know that our competitors are using this very effectively in order to extend their reach into the UN. So can you discuss the State Department's efforts to recruit more Americans into the UN system, help them advance through the system, and why this matters for our national security?
Thank you for that question. And I am going to invite your staff and the staffs of any members of the subcommittee, or really anybody on the Hill, to come over to the State Department. We can give a show and tell of a new tool that we've developed. It's called Advocacy Plus. And with the resources that we were provided last year, we have been able to staff up our Office of Multilateral Strategic Competition and personnel use a new computer database to streamline advocacy and to track the applications of American citizens going in for UN positions. We've been able to fund additional junior professional officer positions, which is terrific. There are about 123 US government funded positions across the UN, not only in New York, but in Geneva, Rome, Vienna. But with this additional money, we have been able to recruit for Americans not only in New York, but also to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, and also out in Bangkok in the Regional Economic Office. So you are absolutely right. Getting well-qualified Americans into the pipeline at the junior and mid-level is key. Of course, we also advocate for special representatives of the Secretary General and other senior level positions as well. But we are very grateful for the bipartisan support we've had from the Hill on pushing forward with advocacy for American citizen employment in the system.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
I now recognize the gentleman from California, Congressman Sherman.
Thank you. Last month, the former United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief focused on the famine in Tigray. And we saw that the Ethiopian authorities, aided by the Eritrean authorities, have used food as a weapon of war. And then they've used their power in the United Nations to prevent a declaration of the famine that they have created. What's happening in Tigray is the world's most dire and devastating hunger crisis in a decade since the devastating famine in Somalia of 2011. Given that this is a man-made famine orchestrated by the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments, who for so many months blocked aid from entering in Tigray and are otherwise preventing the both the transportation of food and preventing farming, it seems odd that a declaration of famine can depend on a host government that's creating the famine. Will you commit to working with the United Nations to formally declare a famine in Tigray?
I was just in Rome, as I mentioned, Representative Sherman, and spoke with David Beasley, who heads up WFP, on Ethiopia, Tigray, and a number of other critical humanitarian situations. And absolutely, we are extremely concerned about the continuing humanitarian crisis out there. The UN's access has been difficult, challenging, uneven, unpredictable in many areas affected by these military operations. Obviously, the conflict out there is a threat to peace and security in the entire Horn of Africa. We are committed to working not only with the WFP, but the other food organizations to facilitate the delivery of this badly needed humanitarian assistance.
Let me just interject. I hope that you're also working for a UN declaration of famine, dealing with the political side of this. Obviously, even more important is the physical side of getting the food trucks in and enough fuel in so that you can move the food around the Tigray area. I want to move on to another question. I've supported our aid to the Palestinian people in the past through UNRWA and otherwise. Teaching the next generation of Israelis and Palestinians to strive for a two-state solution is important. However, the Palestinian Authority curriculum taught to 500,000 Palestinian students, West Bank, Gaza, Syria, Jerusalem, Jordan, moves us further away for peace. It teaches a whole new generation to glorify terrorism and promote anti-Semitism and reject a two-state solution. They identify particular terrorists who have killed dozens of Israeli civilians and teach these children that those are their heroes. When Assistant Secretary Barbara Leaf testified before this committee in June, I asked about the status of implementation of the framework for cooperation, which requires UNRWA to implement reforms, including combatement of incitement and anti-Semitism in the educational curriculum. The UN, UNRWA has put on leave, but just on leave, 6 of its own staff who posted that we must, quote, fight against the Jews and kill them and slaughter the Zionists. Being a little bit of leave seems like a very mild action. These staff have not been terminated. What is the current progress of implementation of the framework for cooperation, including removing anti-Semitic violent content and assuring that UNRWA materials and UNRWA teachers are working for peace?
First of all, of course, violent, hate-filled anti-Semitic sentiments are abhorrent and have no place in classrooms, including the UNRWA-sponsored classrooms. We bring up these issues and allegations with UNRWA. I brought them up with the head of UNRWA, was recently here in Washington to see me. We are committed to working with UNRWA to address these issues. You asked about the U.S. UNRWA framework for cooperation. We do hold with PRM, the Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau, regular discussions on all of this and on holding UNRWA to its commitments on education and these other areas.
Let's make sure these 6 are terminated, being slaughter Zionists and kill all the Jews. That's at a Nazi level. And I point out to my colleagues, there's still a chance to co-sponsor the Peace and Tolerance and Palestinian Education Act, which at least requires a report from the State Department on these UNRWA schools, and I yield back.
I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Congresswoman Houlihan, for 5 minutes.
Hi, and thank you. I wasn't expecting to be next. I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question, though. My questions have to do with the Secretary of State's statement in the wake of the Supreme Court decision regarding Roe. They underscored that the State Department would remain fully committed in helping to provide access to reproductive health services and to advancing reproductive rights around the world. I was hoping that you might be able to expand on that statement. Have you or the Secretary or Ambassador Thomas Greenfield reached out to UN partners working on family planning or reproductive health care like the UNFPA to assure them of your commitment to remain partners in this space?
Thank you for raising UNFPA, a very important partner for the U.S. As we look to expand access to sexual, reproductive, and maternal health care around the world, both in the core funding and programmatic, and also supporting their great work on combating gender-based violence, particularly in humanitarian settings. You asked about the recent Supreme Court ruling. Of course, that does not change in any way, shape, or form the commitment of the Biden-Harris administration to continue advancing sexual and reproductive health rights here at home or abroad. We are working in a number of the hotspots around the world to make sure women and girls' health is lifted up and protected.
Thank you. It is something that's very alarming. As you all know, the UNFPA doesn't provide abortion services, but I can only imagine that they and many others are concerned about what limiting access to safe abortion will do. And I'm grateful to hear that the administration is in tune with that concern. My second question has to do with the UNHRC. On March 4th, the UNHRC held an urgent debate on the situation in Ukraine, and they adopted a resolution that established the Commission of Inquiry, or COI, that would investigate human rights violations and war crimes that are being committed during this conflict. The COI, made up of 3 independent human rights experts, it also is mandated to preserve evidence for future legal proceedings and to cooperate with other judicial and legal entities as appropriate, which is very significant given that the International Criminal Court has opened its own investigation into the conflict in Ukraine. The vote was 32-2 with 13 abstentions, highlighting Russia's international isolation. More recently, the Council met in an emergency session, again overwhelmingly voting to further task the COI with examining atrocities that are being committed by Russians in Kiev's suburbs. Could you please tell me what you believe the significance to be of these actions, and what role is the COI playing in building a case for future accountability for Russian actions in Ukraine? And finally, how is the administration able to support the work of the COI? Is there any way that we could be doing a better job on this particular issue?
Thank you very much. Accountability, a word you just used, that is the key. Not only calling Russia out, but insisting on accountability. And we can see with the support of our partners on launching this commission of inquiry into Russia's actions, the real possibility of delivering justice and accountability. And we mentioned a little earlier this morning the role of the ICC. What I also see is across the UN system, other UN agencies bringing their special skills and mandates to support. For example, UN Women is putting forward its experts to look at these instances of gender-based violence in the Ukraine conflict to be able to support the work of the COI and the ICC.
So do you think that we are better able to support the work of this and other human rights investigations and accountability mechanisms by being part of the council or not?
Absolutely. When we are at the table, we are able to lead. And our ability this year in the March and June sessions, I think is evidence of that. We have seen the impact of energetic, positive U.S. leadership. We've got a great U.S. ambassador to the Human Rights Council out there, Ambassador Michele Taylor. We can be a force for good, and we are. And we are able to, as I mentioned with the work just a few days ago on the passage of the mandate for the UN independent expert on protection against against violence and discrimination on sexual orientation and gender identity, we are able to build bridges across regions and lift up and protect vulnerable populations.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. And with that, I yield back.
I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Congressman Kim.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And I'll try to be quick here. I know we're trying to get the votes, but Assistant Secretary, I wanted to follow up on, you briefly mentioned about the blockade of Odessa, just what we're seeing with, the Russians really hampering our ability to address, food insecurity around the world, devastating the Ukrainian economy. I talked to a number of Ukrainian officials just recently, and this was at the top of the list of what they were asking about. And they did talk about and mention about how the UN's been trying to engage on this and try to see if there's ever an ability to kind of break through this impasse here. So I wanted to just hear from you, just what is the state of these? I don't even know if we call them negotiations or what, where is this right now? Because I promised these Ukrainians I get back to them in terms of understanding what role the UN's really playing, whether you think that this is actually a viable path to be able to break through this and provide a solution, and what role the U.S. is or can play to try to facilitate this.
Yeah, thank you for raising this. We are in close contact with these UN officials. I mentioned OCHA, the coordinator for humanitarian affairs, Martin Griffiths, also UNCTAD, Rebecca Greenspan. We are supporting these efforts, with the of course, urging of Secretary General Guterres as well, supporting Griffiths and Greenspan's efforts to seek solutions that are going to reopen the Black Sea ports and to facilitate these grain exports from Ukraine, making room for a new harvest. And again, not only impacting the immediate region, but countries around the world, from the Middle East to sub-Saharan Africa. Just until this issue is resolved, it's going to increase hunger and famine around the world for months to come. I have to say, we're also pushing back on a lot of disinformation. It's Russia, of course, that's actively blocking the export of food from Ukraine's ports and increasing world hunger. There's been a lot of disinformation out there about U.S. sanctions causing disruptions. That is not the case. And so we are working with our partners to make sure that the word gets out as to who and why these exports of food from Ukraine are being blocked and exacerbating hunger around the world.
So I guess I just wanted to get a bit clearer sense. I mean, are would you actually categorize this as negotiations? Is this a formal process? And I guess my question is, are the Russians actually participating in this in any type of good faith? Is there any sense that the Russians are engaging with the UN and others in a process that actually might be able to yield a solution here?
Look, I'm going to say up front that Russia's blatant disregard for global food security has been evident. It's reprehensible. The UN officials, with our encouragement and support, continue in their efforts, in their discussions to engage, to identify solutions. We are, of course, also working with our partners on the other piece of this, which is to boost the global food supply, to look at the supply of fertilizers. So it's not just the ports getting back up and running, it's the fuel issues as well. The bottom line is calling on Putin to immediately and unconditionally cease the aggression against Ukraine, but also for Russia to end this blockade of these exports.
Okay. Well, look, thanks for your update on that. And I know you touched on some food insecurity issues about just the challenges we're having around the world. So let's make sure we follow up on that. I'd love to figure out how we can be more forward leaning on this, just given the sheer magnitude of the problem that we're facing around the world. Obviously, the blockade of Odessa plays a role in that, but let's make sure that we're firing on all cylinders here between the executive and the legislature to try to solve that problem. So thank you. And with that, Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you to our witness for testifying today and the members for joining us. There is a lot to follow up on, and I look forward to working with you on these important priorities. With that, the hearing is adjourned.